Hello and welcome to the Silverstripe screencast. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about filtering a list of items on a template through the navigation. This is going to be applicable to something like a blog where you have categories and tags and things that you want to filter by in like a sidebar. We've done this before by filtering through form inputs. Now we're going to do it through the navigation. So let's get into what we'll cover here. There's quite a bit of setup, but it's all pretty relevant. We will first set up some new relationships for the data objects that we can use for filtering. Then we'll add some lists of filter links. So this is going to be the part where we actually create links in the sidebar that you can click on and it will go to a filtered URL. Then we're going to set up those filtered routes. So this is all about creating new URLs that map to a filtered list. Then we'll add the filtered link methods to the data objects. Sounds a bit out there right now, but you'll see what we mean by that as we get into it. Then we will really do kind of the meat of the filtering here, which is in the controller. We're going to run those queries and create the filtered list. Lastly, we're going to add some filter headers to the list so the user always knows the filtered state. Before we get started, it's really important in this lesson to have a rich supply of data to work with. So be sure you download the database and assets that are attached to this lesson. It's right here next to the video. Just click on that button and you'll get a import.sql file as well as an assets folder. Put that assets folder in your project, import the SQL file, and you'll get about 100 or so randomly composed article page objects. We're going to be using articles for this lesson, and that's what we're going to be filtering. So pretty important to have that import down if you don't have a variety of data in your database already. So let's get into setting up some new relationships. Now this is kind of fundamental. It's just some setup work we have to do. Looking at the travel guides page, we can see that there are a number of different filters that we can apply in the sidebar. So we have a list of categories and an archive of previous months and years, as well as some tags. Now we're not going to be using tags for these articles. We'll be replacing it with a filter for regions because optionally each of these travel guides can pertain to a region. So before we add the filter, let's just set up that relationship. We'll go and add a has one to region on article page and a has many from region back to article page. So each article can have a region. Maybe this article is about the Northeast or the Northwest, whatever. And each of those regions can then tell you how many articles it has about it. So this is all pretty boilerplate stuff here. We've seen the has one, we've seen the drop-down field, but just to recap, we've set up that has one to region. That creates a region ID field, and that's what we use in our drop-down field to create that relationship. The drop-down field is going to refer to region ID, and we populate the drop-down with a list of all the regions, with a map of the ID as the key, and then the title as the text in the drop-down. And lastly, we want to be able to opt out of that region as well. So we apply an empty string that simply says none if you want to opt out. On the other side, we'll go to region and we'll just set up a simple has many to articles. Now you're not going to manage this relationship in the CMS. You're not going to add articles to a region through a grid field. So we're just going to ignore that. The key here is that the region can get all of the articles that are related to it. So this has many is what's really important here. So now just run a dev build !flush. Now if you've already imported the database, this is kind of a pointless step because you already have those fields, but it's still critical to run an update to the model, so that flush is really important there. Again, you might not see any green fields if you've imported the database. The next step in our lesson is to add a list of filtered links. So now we can actually start creating some filters. Let's look at our article holder controller and make sure that it can feed regions into its sidebar. All you have to do here is add a method called regions to the article holder class that simply dumps out all the regions on the regions page. This should be in the model of article holder. It should not be in the controller. Kind of makes no difference in practice, but it really is something that belongs in the model. This shouldn't be something that only can be done on a specific page. So we'll put it in the model. In practice, you'd probably want this to have a sort or a limit on it, because in general, just dumping data unsorted using all the default settings is not a great idea. It's not very predictable, but for demonstration purposes, this will work fine. Now notice that we don't just want to dump out region get like we might think, just getting all the regions in the database. This is a common mistake that developers make. Remember that regions are actually belong to a parent region page, And if that page were ever deleted and replaced, we would end up with all these orphaned regions that would show up in the list that wouldn't really make any sense anymore. Now, unless you had some sort of routine that was run or a hook that you had applied to the regions page that deleted all of its regions on delete, you're going to have all those orphaned records. So it's really good to be explicit here and just state that you're getting all of the regions belonging to the regions page that's currently published. Don't just do a dump of everything in the table because it won't necessarily be relevant. Now we'll need to add all these to the template, so replace the tags section with the list of regions. Now getting the number of articles associated with a region is a simple call to the articles relation. Every list in Silverstripe, which implements the SS list interface that we talked about in a previous tutorial, they all expose a count method, and we can just get the number of records in that list. Now notice that we're calling a non-existent method on region. We call it articles link. That doesn't exist yet, but it will return a URL to the travel guide section with the appropriate region filter applied. Don't worry about how we're going to do that yet. We'll create that later, but right now it's just a placeholder. It does need to be dynamically created though, because every region is going to refer to a route, maybe with the region ID in it, that will filter the list. So we will need that. Now, while we're in this section, we should light up the list of categories in the sidebar. This is actually a bit easier than the list of regions because article holder already has a has many to categories. We manage the categories on that article holder page. If you can remember from way back in an earlier lesson, we set that up. So all you have to do here is just loop categories, and that's pretty straightforward. Categories also has an articles method that we'll use to get the count. Now that articles method we get thanks to the belongs many that we defined in article category. At the time, this definition didn't really mean much, but now we are seeing the true power of it. We can just get any category and look back at the number of articles that it's associated with. So very useful. A lot of times you want to know what categories are part of an article, but you also want to know what articles are in a category. So many belongs many work together very well. Now, like we did before, we call a non-existent link method on every category object, and we'll define that later. And refresh the page and see that our categories are appearing correctly. Now, just a quick note, let's look at the template again. If you're wondering about the difference in semantics between the articles link versus just link, it's just a matter of context. An article category object's canonical link should really just be to a list of articles. It really isn't used anywhere else. Now, a region has its own detail page, so link is really reserved for that. So using a region to filter a list of articles is a special use of a region, so we use a specially named method, articles link. We're going to save the date archive links until the next lesson. That introduces a fair amount of complexity and it's out of scope for this, but we'll just lay down the basics. So let's get a few things working before we dive into that. Now we can start setting up the filtered routes. So let's think about what we want out of these links. We essentially have 4 states. There's the default state with no filters. There's the filter by region, there's filter by category, and there's filter by date, which, like I said, we're going to deal with that later, but it's important to know for now. A good place to start is to envision what you want the routes to look like for each one of these states. So we can pretty easily imagine something like this. We would have travel guide /region/123, which would be to show the articles related to region ID 123. We might have something like travel guides /category/123, which would show all of the articles related to that category ID. We could also have something like /date/2015/05, and that would show articles from May 2015. And we could take this a step further. Optionally, it would be nice if we allowed the user to omit the month and show an entire year. So travel guide /date/2015 would work as well. These intuitive, semantically correct URL routes always earn us big points, so be thinking of these things. The first thing we'll need in our controller is a list of allowed actions. We've done this before. Let's add the category, region, and date to that list. And since we've updated a private static variable, be sure to run !flush at this point. We are now ready to add the filtered link methods to data objects. Now, these are those placeholders we talked about earlier. Now that we know what the routes will look like, we can get back to the region and article category classes and define those link methods. So I'm just going to define articles link in region.php. Now, it's always a good idea to put a guard around the page actually existing. Never assume that the site tree will always be the same. This can cause real problems when a user has installed the project from the code repository, but has not yet imported the database. Now, interesting to note, the linking mode that we've implemented on our region object is actually agnostic enough to still work on our article holder page. Look what it does. It just checks to see if the request parameter ID equals the region ID, and if so, it will return current. So these filtered links actually can have a current state now, even in the article holder, because the linking mode method is just checking if the region ID is present in the URL parameter. So now we'll go back to article category, and remember the link method here we just called link because the filtered list of articles is the canonical state for an article category. So we'll just say we'll get the parent article holder. We know that exists, and we will just link to category/this ID. So refresh the page and see that the categories and regions link to the correct URLs. And we're now ready to start filtering through controller actions and start actually manipulating this list and creating this these filtered views. So let's start by defining the base list of articles. We know that at a minimum, we only want articles that are children of this page, and we'll sort them in reverse chronological order. We could just say article page get and sort by date descending. That may yield the same thing at this point, but in the long term, that's not a great solution. We may someday have multiple article holder pages, and we don't want to be showing children of old article holders that don't exist anymore. This is almost exactly like the same problem we had with regions. You don't want to just get everything in the table. That's not necessarily the most accurate picture of what we have. Ultimately, what we want here is for the controller to start with this base list, and each controller action will filter it down further. So this is a great use case for the init method in our controller. This is executed before any actions happen. So we've used init before to inject assets, JavaScript, CSS into the template. We're going to use it for a different purpose here. We'll first define a member variable article list, and the init method will define that list as article page get. We'll filter by parent ID, and then we will sort it in reverse chronological. Now, if you're wondering here why we don't just use children, which effectively does the same thing, that's because children is a special method that modifies its list post-query. It actually has to run the database query to get its list, and what you get back is actually an array list, not a data list. So that would preclude us from adding these sorts of filters that we wanted to use. And remember, the lazy loading is coming in really helpful here because we actually haven't done anything at this point. All we've created is a reference to a query that could possibly happen at some time. We have not executed any SQL just by saying this article list equals article page get, etc. So we're going to keep modifying this as we go through the controller actions. Now we know we want the articles to be paginated, right? So let's just deal with that now. We'll create a method that applies a paginated list to the article list member variable. And this will be our single point of access to get this list that we're building. So the reason we don't do this in the controller action is just because it would be really repetitive to keep creating paginated lists. We know that the page length is always going to be the same. We're always dealing with the same article list. So let's do this in one central place and then have the template call this paginated articles method. And that will be the one way that we can get our source of truth for the articles. Now back in the template, we'll change the loop block to use paginated articles. And we need the pagination HTML. We've done this before. If we revisit the property search results.ss file, you can just copy that out. Now, if you're boiling inside thinking about the dry violations, don't repeat yourself. Just relax. We're going to address this duplication of content in another lesson. It does bring up another important point that we want to cover in these lessons. So just for now, just take a deep breath, copy and paste it. No one will know. Just make sure you change that $results to $paginated articles. So now we're ready to add our first filter for category. Let's define the category action. We start first by checking if the category exists. If we don't, we throw a 404, which makes sense. Then we would update the article list by filtering the current one against the many relation categories. Now, this is a wonderful example of the power of the ORM. You can see here that the abstraction layer allows us to filter by a parameter that is not necessarily a field in the database. Rather, it's a named relationship in our code. The filter categories.id simply asks for all the articles that contain the given category ID in their list of related categories. So it's a really interesting way of expressing this. Again, this would never work in just plain SQL. We have the ability to refer to these named relationships using the ORM. So it's actually generating a lot of SQL there that we're not seeing, but we get to express it in a very declarative, simple way. Now at the end of the function, we want to return the selected category to the template. This will be important when adding text to the page that shows the filtered state. Now notice that we don't return the list of articles in the controller. The articles are going to be paginated, and we want to avoid that redundancy like we talked about. We've got that one single point of entry called paginated articles, and we're just going to get it through there. So test it out now and see that we have our first filter working. We can filter by a category, and it's all working as expected. So now let's add our next filter for regions, and it's going to work in much the same way. So again, we check if the region exists. If it doesn't, we 404, and we create that article list as a new incarnation of the list that filters by region ID. And we return the selected region to the template. Give that a try and see if it's working. Now the last thing we need to do is we need to apply these filter headers that we've been talking about. We've got these selected region, selected category that we're returning to the template. We haven't done anything with it yet. So let's go into articleholder.ss, and just right above the list, we will first check to see if the variable selected region exists. And if it does, we just render the title off that object. And we say, you're currently filtering by region, selected region.title. Do the same thing for the category. Now give that a try and see that you now get some nice headings showing up that reflect the state of the list. Now one missing piece that you'll notice is if we click into the detail page, it still has a static sidebar. Now getting this to work requires teaching a new concept, and we're going to address that in one of the next 2 lessons. So just stay tuned for that. We'll deal with that duplication. But for now, be happy that we have a nice filtered list working. We're going to address the dates in the next lesson, so also stay tuned for that. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments about this lesson, please leave them below.